I stepped onto the cracked driveway of the little blue house on Elm Street with the weight of 6 months of salt, storms, and silence still clinging to my bones, the duffel bag digging into my shoulder like an accusation. The taxi pulled away behind me, leaving only the late afternoon light and the smell of cut grass that somehow felt more foreign than the open ocean. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the ship: unlock the door, drop the bag, stand in the empty rooms and pretend the loneliness was temporary. What I had not rehearsed was the sound of something clattering hard against concrete next door, followed by the blur of a woman launching herself off her porch without shoes, bare feet flashing across the shared strip of lawn as if the ground itself might vanish if she did not reach me in time. If this story of unexpected kindness and second chances already stirs something in you, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to believe in people again, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. We tell these stories so that quiet acts of care do not disappear unnoticed. She did not slow down. Her hair was half pinned and half wild from whatever task she had abandoned, laundry basket tipped on its side, white sheets spilling across her steps like surrendered flags. I stood frozen with one hand still on the strap of my bag, heart slamming harder than it had during the worst gale of the voyage, watching her close the distance with the desperate speed of someone who had been holding their breath for months. When she reached me, she did not speak at first. She simply stopped 3 feet away, chest heaving, eyes already shining, and the sight of those bare feet on the cool grass, toes curled against the earth as if to anchor herself, cracked something open inside my chest that the sea had never managed to break. 6 months earlier I had boarded the freighter with the same quiet resignation I always carried. The contract was good money, the route familiar enough to be almost safe, and the alternative, staying in that silent house with its unwashed coffee mugs and unopened mail, felt heavier than any cargo. The ocean does not care about your reasons. It takes the hours and stretches them into something endless. Nights on watch stretched into gray dawns where the horizon refused to offer comfort. Storms arrived without apology, turning the deck into a tilted battlefield of green water and screaming wind. I learned again how small a man becomes when the only solid thing under him is steel and the only voices are the radio and the memory of people who are not there. Sleep came in fragments. Food tasted like necessity. The other men talked about wives and kids and the beers waiting at the end of the rotation. I listened and nodded and kept my own ledger of absences carefully closed. What I could not close was the quiet fear that had started the last time I came home. The house had felt colder then. The neighbor, her name was Mara, had waved from her porch the way people do when they are being polite to a near stranger who lives 15 yards away. We had exchanged weather comments and occasional borrowed tools over the years. Nothing more. Yet somewhere in those 6 months the fear had grown teeth. What if the house was not empty because I was away, but because the world had simply continued without me and found no reason to wait? Ships sink. Men disappear. The ocean keeps its secrets. I had read the delayed weather reports and the careful language of the company emails and felt the old familiar cold settle between my ribs. Now she stood in front of me with grass stains already darkening the soles of her feet and tears tracking clean paths through the faint dust on her cheeks. The afternoon light caught the wetness and made it look almost luminous. I opened my mouth to say something ordinary, hello, or I'm back, or why are you crying, but the words dissolved. She closed the last small distance and pressed her forehead against my chest the way a person does when they need proof that the body in front of them is solid and breathing. I felt the tremor running through her shoulders. My free arm came up without permission and settled across her back, the duffel bag sliding to the ground with a dull thud that neither of us acknowledged. We stood like that long enough for the sun to shift and for a car to pass on the street without slowing. When she finally pulled back, her voice was rough from disuse or from holding everything in. She told me, in broken pieces, that the storm reports had been worse than usual this rotation. That a freighter on a parallel route had sent distress signals 2 weeks earlier. That the company updates had grown sparse and formal. That she had started leaving the porch light on at my house every night because the dark windows looked too final. That she had watered the struggling rosebush by the steps and brought in the packages and spoken to the empty rooms once or twice the way people do when silence becomes unbearable. She had not expected to see me step out of a taxi this afternoon. The sight of me had simply torn the careful control she had been practicing. I listened while the weight of the voyage rearranged itself inside me. The storms that had felt personal at sea suddenly looked different when filtered through someone else's fear. The nights I had spent staring at the radar and calculating odds were nights she had spent watching the sky from her kitchen window, wondering which set of coordinates might swallow a man she barely knew. The absurdity of it, two lonely people on opposite sides of an ocean, each inventing the worst for the other, should have been comic. Instead it felt like the first honest thing that had happened in a very long time. We moved eventually to the weathered bench that sat between our properties, the one neither of us had claimed ownership of over the years. She sat with her bare feet tucked under her, still reluctant to put shoes back on, as if the contact with the earth was the only thing keeping the moment real. I told her, in the same unhurried way the sea forces you to speak, about the crossing. Not the heroic version. The real one. The night the waves stacked higher than the bridge and the hull shuddered like it was considering giving up. The morning a young deckhand nearly went over the side and I grabbed the back of his harness with both hands and felt the entire ocean pull against me. The long stretches of calm that were somehow worse because they left too much room for thought. I told her about the letter I had started writing home 3 times and never finished because there was no one specific left to address it to. My parents were years gone. The brief marriage that had ended before the sea became permanent had left no forwarding address for grief. The house was simply the place I returned to when the contract ran out. She listened without interrupting, the way people do when they recognize the shape of someone else's loneliness. Then she told me her own quieter storms. The husband who had worked the same trade and never come back from a winter run 5 years earlier. The way the neighborhood had offered casseroles and then slowly returned to its own business. The decision to stay in the house next door because leaving felt like abandoning the last place that still remembered him. The strange comfort she had found in tending the small neglected things on my side of the fence, pulling weeds, collecting the circulars that piled up, once even replacing a burned-out porch bulb so the dark would not look so complete. She had not done it for me specifically, she said. She had done it because empty houses frightened her, and because the act of care, even anonymous, kept something inside her from rusting shut. The light softened into evening while we talked. Neither of us suggested going inside. The grass grew cool under our feet. A dog barked 2 streets over and then fell quiet. I realized I had not felt this particular kind of exhaustion in years, the good kind that comes after a long-held breath is finally released. The sea had taken 6 months of my life and returned me thinner, quieter, and somehow more raw than when I left. Sitting there with grass stains on my work boots and a woman who had run barefoot across a yard because she was afraid I was gone, I understood that the real voyage had not been the one measured in nautical miles. Days began to gather after that afternoon. I unpacked the duffel and found that someone had dusted the shelves and left a small plant on the kitchen windowsill that had not been there before. Mara brought over soup the first night without asking if I wanted company, then stayed because the alternative was both of us eating alone 15 yards apart. We fell into a rhythm that felt less like obligation and more like the careful rebuilding of something neither of us had names for yet. She taught me the names of the birds that nested in the oak between our houses. I told her the stars that had guided the old navigators when the electronics failed. We sat on the shared bench most evenings and let the silence be companionable instead of accusing. There were harder moments. The first time a weather report came through about a system building in the Pacific, I felt the old tightening in my chest and she saw it and simply moved closer on the bench until our shoulders touched. The night I woke from a dream of green water closing over the deck and found myself standing in the dark kitchen, she was already on her porch with the light on, as if she had somehow felt the disturbance. We did not speak of it the next morning. We did not need to. The understanding had already settled between us like silt after a storm. Weeks became a month. The rosebush she had kept alive began to push out new buds. I fixed the loose board on her back steps without being asked. She left a thermos of coffee on my porch the morning I had an early appointment at the company office to discuss the next contract. I left the contract and signed on the table for 3 days while I walked the neighborhood and listened to the ordinary sounds of people living ordinary lives. When I finally tore the paper into careful squares and dropped them into the recycling bin, the relief was so sharp it almost frightened me. The change was not dramatic in the way movies prefer. It was quieter. It was the decision to stay when leaving had always been the easier current. It was the discovery that someone else's fear for your life could become the reason you finally valued it yourself. It was the understanding that kindness does not always arrive with speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives as a woman who drops everything, kicks off her shoes, and runs across a stretch of grass because the alternative, remaining still while the person she has quietly come to care for might be lost, is unbearable. By the time the first real cold of autumn arrived, the two houses no longer felt like separate fortresses. The path between them had been worn smoother by repeated crossings. We cooked in one kitchen or the other. We argued gently about the best way to stake tomato plants and the worst movies of the previous decade. We sat through a thunderstorm one night with the windows open and did not flinch when the lightning came close. The sea still lived in my dreams, but it no longer owned the waking hours. I think often about the precise second she began to run. The way the laundry basket tipped. The white sheets catching the light. The bare feet striking the earth with the urgency of someone who has decided that dignity is less important than presence. That image has become the hinge on which everything else turns. Before it, I was a man who returned from the ocean to an empty house and accepted emptiness as the natural order. After it, I was a man who understood that someone had been keeping a light on for him in more ways than one, and that the only reasonable response was to step fully into the life that light made visible. There are still mornings when I wake and listen for the particular quiet that used to mean I was alone. It no longer frightens me. The house next door is never entirely dark. The rosebush continues to surprise us with late blooms. And sometimes, when the weather turns and the wind carries the distant smell of salt, I walk outside and find her already standing in the yard, shoes discarded, toes pressed into the grass as if testing the reliability of solid ground. We do not always speak. We do not need to. The running has already said everything that mattered. If this story reached something tender in you, if the image of bare feet crossing a yard in pure relief made your own chest tighten with recognition, please take a moment now to like the video, leave a comment sharing a moment when someone's unexpected kindness changed the course of your days, share it with a friend who needs reminding that they are not as alone as they fear, and subscribe to Kindness Corner so these quiet reckonings with the heart continue to find their way to people who need them. Just before we close, I have one special request: write one word in the comments that captures how this story left you feeling. Just one word. Relief. Hope. Home. Whatever rose up in you when she started to run. Those single words become a kind of shared shoreline for everyone who watched. The ocean will always be out there, vast and indifferent and capable of swallowing men whole. But there are also yards, and grass, and people who will drop everything and cross them without shoes when it matters. That is the part worth remembering. That is the part that brings a man home in every sense of the word.